This woman was used to seeing animals in her garden because she lived near the forest, but one day, she saw an animal she had never seen before. The mysterious animal made her nervous and anxious, so she decided to call for help. With help, she started a search, but it wouldn't go as expected. Woman calls for help after spotting strange animal in her yard, but nobody expected to find this. Charlotte loved her home. It was a little remote and near the woods, so she would see all kinds of animals in her garden. But this time, it was different. Charlotte was looking out over her garden when her eyes suddenly halted on a shadowy figure on the border. It was an animal. A frown appeared on her face as she squinted her eyes. But right at that moment, the animal stepped out from the shadow, and Charlotte let out a surprising yelp. Her eyes grew wide as she stared at the animal. It looked wild and dangerous. It definitely wasn't domesticated. What was it? Charlotte fumbled a little as she grabbed her phone and took a picture of the animal. It made her uncomfortable, and she wanted to know if it was dangerous and if there was an old acquaintance from high school who could probably help her. She looked through her phone for his number and dialed him. The acquaintance, Joe, was a hunter and agreed to come over. Once he arrived, Charlotte showed him the picture and explained what she saw. "Looks like a canine animal, definitely some sort of predator," Joe said, fueling Charlotte's fear. "Why is it here? Where did it come from?" she asked anxiously. "I understand how you feel, but there is no reason to worry," Joe said, trying to calm Charlotte down. However, Charlotte couldn't help but notice that Joe's hands were trembling as he opened the back door. Charlotte thought he was hiding his nerves to make her feel safe, so she smiled, but not for long. Because Joe asked her to show him where the animal stood and gestured for her to come with him. Charlotte looked around anxiously as she hesitantly guided the hunter to where she had seen the animal. Once there, her fears became true as they found remains. This animal was a predator and dangerous. With that information, the duo returned to the house. Charlotte was worried, and when she looked at Joe, she saw a mixture of nerves and excitement. The hunter explained he didn't have the right equipment and needed to go home to prepare better. "We can't follow it in the dark anyway," he said. Charlotte looked outside and noticed dusk was falling. She knew Joe was right but had a hard time accepting it. From the moment the hunter left, her worries and fear increased. She thought she could hear the animal but was too scared to look, so it took her a long time to fall asleep. After a draining night, Charlotte got up and immediately went to her back door. The moment she set foot in her garden, her body froze. There were paw prints near the door. She did hear the animal last night. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest as she called Joe. She didn't like this at all. Charlotte paced around the room while on the phone with Joe, but she suddenly halted. There, the animal was again on the border of her garden. "Hurry up," she exclaimed to Joe over the phone, explaining that she was looking at the mysterious animal right now. Moments later, the hunter arrived. Charlotte quickly welcomed him and grabbed the equipment Joe handed her. "Let's go," the hunter said. Charlotte hesitantly swung the backpack over her shoulders and showed Joe where she had seen the animal, just like the day before. "Be careful and stay behind me," Joe urged Charlotte when he saw fresh tracks. The duo tracked the paw prints and other traces deeper and deeper into the woods. They made up a lot of ground quickly, and Joe said the tracks seemed to get fresher. "We're getting closer," he said with a mix of excitement and hurry in his voice. Meanwhile, Charlotte was contemplating her decision to come. With each step she took, she grew more anxious, but this was the only way she would find out what that mysterious animal was and why it was in her garden. The thought gave Charlotte courage and determination, but then the duo suddenly heard some leaves rustling behind them, and the fear inside Charlotte reignited. Charlotte and Joe abruptly stopped, and as they did, the rustling did as well. The duo looked around them and listened carefully. There was no indication the animal was in their direct vicinity, so they continued carefully. But it seemed they weren't careful enough because a few minutes later, they suddenly heard a low growl. It was hard to place where it came from as it seemed to come from multiple directions. Were there more of them? Were they in trouble? Was it worth it to try and find the animal? Charlotte turned pale and stepped closer to Joe, who grabbed her arm in support. The duo looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source. Charlotte held her breath and fought her tears as she realized the growl was getting louder. Charlotte's body tensed up, preparing herself to run for her life, and then they suddenly heard a lot of movement not too far from them. That was the final straw. "Let's go back," Charlotte said with a quivering voice. She grabbed his hand and opened her mouth to urge him, but no sound came out. Because suddenly the animal came into view. It was running away from them. "Let's go," Joe said as he grabbed Charlotte by the arm. The fact that the animal was running away relieved Charlotte, and her curiosity was sparked when she saw the animal again. She had never seen anything like it before. Joe's grip around her arm tightened as they struggled to keep up. "Hurry up," he urged her as the animal almost disappeared from sight. But then, out of nowhere, a huge figure emerged from the shadow right beside the animal. It felt like Charlotte's heart skipped multiple beats and slapped her hand before her mouth to silence her yell from fright. They hid in the vegetation and watched how the figure caught the animal using a net. Their minds were racing. "He must have been making the noises we heard," Joe whispered, sparking many questions in Charlotte's mind. Who was he? Where did he come from? And what does he want with the mysterious animal? Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the man and tried to find answers. The duo silently watched how the man took the animal with him. Charlotte didn't know what to do now, but Joe did. There was only one way to answer all their questions: following him. He wasn't aware of their presence, so they could find out what was going on if they were careful. The fact that an unknown man captured the animal made Charlotte even more curious. What could it be? Her curiosity won from her nerves, and she agreed with Joe's plan. She stayed close behind him and followed the man, who eventually led them to a clearing with a cabin. The duo remained in the shadows. Charlotte's heart was still pounding, and she was nervously looking around, making sure there weren't any more surprises. When she was satisfied, her focus returned to the man and his actions. He struggled with the animal as he tried to get it inside a cage. But then Charlotte's eyes grew big. Because the cage the man was busy with wasn't the only one. Beside it stood two more cages which were filled with the same kind of mysterious animal. Charlotte's mind was racing. There were more? What were they? What was this man doing? "What is going on?" she asked with a quivering voice. Then Charlotte heard a sigh beside her and looked at Joe. It looked like he knew exactly what was happening. "It looks like he's breeding these animals," he said. Charlotte thought about it, and it seemed to be the most logical explanation. Why else would he have these animals in this remote location? The more Charlotte thought about it and watched the man's actions, the more she felt something seriously wrong was going on here. Her breathing quickened as she realized they may be in danger. This was way beyond their reach, and they needed help. "We should call the police," she whispered. But Joe shook his head to show his disapproval of her idea. "Those animals are dangerous. Who knows how they would react when police come barging in? We have to solve this problem delicately," he said. This seemed odd to Charlotte. But he was the expert, so she trusted his opinion. They stared at the huge man, who vanished inside the cabin. Charlotte was hesitant as she didn't know what to do. The man was huge, and even though the animals were caged, they could still be dangerous. She voiced her concern. "So we have to be very careful," Joe said while clutching his rifle. Joe took the lead, and Charlotte hesitantly followed him. Her heart was pounding, but her urge to get answers was bigger than her nerves. Step by step, they got closer to the cabin, and it seemed like they would make it, but then the animals suddenly started growling, notifying the man. Without any indication, the front door of the cabin flew open, and the huge man came out with an axe in his hand. "What are you doing here?" he screamed at the duo, swinging his axe frantically. Charlotte couldn't contain her fear, so she screamed and sobbed. "We're sorry. We will leave." But as suddenly as the man appeared, so sudden did his mood change. "I'm very sorry," he said in a gentle tone. He tried to calm Charlotte down by explaining he thought they were someone else and wanted to scare them away. The man put away his axe and repeated his first question more nicely. But the moment he let go of his axe, Joe grabbed his chance. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The man didn't seem eager to respond, so Joe aimed his rifle at him. "Let these animals go, or I will shoot," Joe said with a severe tone as he cocked his rifle. The sudden escalation caught Charlotte by surprise, and she didn't know what to think of it, but it appeared to have worked. The huge man pleaded with Joe not to shoot him. "I can explain everything. Please let me do that." Joe nodded, but right before the man could start, Charlotte's voice sounded. She had been standing beside the cages, and the question that had been bothering her for the last 2 days needed answering. "What is this animal? It's been terrorizing me and my garden." "I'm scared," she said. The man's gaze turned to Charlotte in surprise, but he gladly took this opportunity. "They are coy wolves," the man said. And when he saw Charlotte's confused expression, he explained that they were a hybrid between coyotes and wolves. "They aren't usually seen around here, so I understand your confusion," he said seriously as his expression suddenly turned dark. Charlotte frowned as she watched the man. What was going on? But then the man turned back to Joe. "As I said, I can explain everything," he said. He then started by saying that he had found these 3 animals wandering around, making him curious as they weren't from here. They seemed to come from a secretive structure further into the woods. The building was highly secured with cameras and fences, so he couldn't get a look inside. But the fact that these animals were wandering around such a suspicious building said enough for him. "I think there are people illegally breeding these animals inside the building," he said with a sigh. Charlotte stared at the man in disbelief. "And these animals?" she asked, pointing to the cages. The man explained he captured the animals he came across to nurture them and planned to set them free in their natural habitat, but he lived in constant fear the breeders would find him. The man seemed to tell the truth, and apart from the welcome, he hadn't shown any sign of wanting to hurt them. Charlotte thought they could trust the man, but Joe was hesitant. "So, why are you out here all alone? Why didn't you call the cops on the breeders?" The man sighed and explained he had no proof there actually were any breeders. He was still trying to figure the situation out. "Right now, I look like a criminal. I didn't want to contact the police until I had the facts straight. It was the best plan he could come up with." Then, the man sat on the bench in front of his cabin, and everything changed at that moment. Because all of a sudden, Joe jumped at the man and hit him in the face with the butt of his gun, taking the man by surprise. "What are you doing?" Charlotte exclaimed. The man was struggling on the ground, and Joe jumped on his back, keeping him in place while he searched his backpack for a rope. "We've been looking for those coy wolves for weeks," Joe hissed as he tied the man down. "And now I finally found them." Charlotte didn't know what she was hearing. Even though he was tied up, the man kept struggling furiously. "So you're one of them?" "I was right," he exclaimed to Joe. The hunter just nodded, and an eerie smile appeared on his face. "Those lost coy wolves were a big pain in our ass." "Thanks for keeping them," Joe said with a laugh. Charlotte stood frozen and gazed at the scene in front of her. She couldn't believe Joe would ever do something like this. What could she do? He was still holding his gun. "Time to bring the good news," Joe said as he took out his phone with his free hand. With his focus on the man and his phone call, Charlotte grabbed her chance. It felt like her body moved on her own as she grabbed a big branch and hit Joe on his head. She quickly untied the man. "I never thought he would do something like that," Charlotte said apologetically. But the man didn't respond, and once he was free, he immediately took control of the situation. He made sure Joe was incapacitated and tied him up with the ropes that had just been his restraints. He realized this situation was now way out of control. They had to call the cops. Charlotte and the man explained everything when the police arrived, and the man guided them toward the secretive building. Joe agreed to grant them access and told them how many co-conspirators there were for a sentence reduction, and within moments, the police raid was successful. Everyone was then brought to the station. During the raid, the police found enough evidence to put the breeders away for a long time, but Charlotte and the man were still a part of the trial, because their testimonials ensured the breeders got an even longer sentence. Thanks to their efforts, the illegal breeding operation was stopped, but that wasn't all. Because under the supervision of the police, Charlotte and the man made sure all the animals would go to a sanctuary where they would be nurtured until they were healthy enough to be sent back into the wild. And when that was arranged, Charlotte could finally return home and relax.